This week we're investigating one of probably the most fraught and also controversial subjects in America, which is that of social stratification. It's something that is controversial and political and all those things because we're all taught that we're a classless society. And we are actually one of the most class-based societies of all the industrialized nations. We have the greatest discrepancy between the wealthiest of us and the poorest of us, which you'll see in a graphic I put up in the course for this week. And those differences have huge repercussions for people, as you'll see as we work through this. So this is the second half of chapter 9, and beginning with social stratification. The definition of stratification, first of all, the word stratification has the word strata in it. Strata means layers. If you've taken geology, you've maybe gone on field trips or you've noticed on your own, particularly highway cuts, you could see them when there's a bank, these layers of earth of different colors, and that represents different ages and a variety of other things, time periods. So that's what strata means. It's like layering of people from lowest to highest in terms of access to wealth, privilege, other resources. So the definition in your book is of the hierarchical relationships between groups as though they were arranged in layers or strata. And they can be those groups can be different, have unequal access to things, inequality based on a variety of measures. There's all sorts of different aspects of life that this applies to. So it can be material resources, which has to do with wealth, obviously, power, and that's where the hierarchy comes in, human welfare. Just how well are you doing generally, physically and psychologically, and a variety of other things. Education. Boy, education is huge in terms of different access to resources. There are various symbolic attributes that go along with different classes, upper class, lower class, what kind of cars people drive, neighborhoods they live in, schools they attend, that type of thing, and privilege. So obviously, I think it's pretty obvious, unless you're highly evolved consciousness, generally, if you're privileged, you want to maintain your privilege. And that's where this zero-sum concept comes in, that if other people rise, I'm going to lose something, instead of we all kind of rise together, and my life is better if other people's lives are better, which is a non-zero-sum way of thinking and a non-highly privileged way of thinking. But generally, as your text points out, privileged people want to maintain their privileges. It's interesting, and you will also hear people say things like, well, it's always been this way. There's always been the rich and the poor and the people in control and the people. No, that's not true in human history, as your text points out. This kind of intense social stratification really emerged rather late in human history, and it emerged around the time of the beginnings of agriculture. Now, remember, in the domestication of plants and animals, we talked about this, I think, previously, occurred about 10,000 years ago. And that's when people started living in villages for the first time, very tiny villages, but they didn't have to move around anymore because they learned how to plant their food so they could stay in one place instead of foraging and hunting. And so that first 5,000 years, approximately, of the 10,000 years, period of settlement was foraging, technically, not agriculture. Agriculture occurs with the invention of the plow, which means that there's some sort of mechanical means between, the person growing the food, etc. So the plow, the initial origins, invention of the plow involved human labor, and then very quickly the labor of big animals like oxen and things of that nature. So there was some inequality that started at the initial settlement, because once you can grow food, it frees other people up to do other things. So people became focused on particular, well, we might call occupations today, sandal makers and basket makers and, potters and a variety of things. And people could trade the value of what they were creating for food and sustenance. Well, the other thing is people started hoarding, particularly around 5,000 years ago. People realized that if you could control a food source, you could control, you were in charge. And so granaries were built with huge storages, and the granaries were built prior to this as well to store grain. But around 5,000 years ago, there started to be states and leaders and cities and things of that nature who kind of either taxed or controlled those stored food sources. And so that's when hierarchy really started, and privilege really started. Instead of everybody, like hunter-gatherers for the previous, tens of thousands of years of human history, hunter-gatherers share with each other. They share equally. If one, when they bring it back to the small band level society that they live in. So this has not been, in fact, we lived many more years as humans without this level of social stratification. But it's been long enough, 5 to 10,000 years, long enough that we think that it's always been this way. And I was glad that your book pointed out that that's not true. Today, virtually some form of social stratification is virtually universal across societies. But there are crucial differences now among various ways of identifying stratification systems and who's in what layer, et cetera, et cetera. And there's two kinds: an ascribed status and an achieved status. An ascribed status means that you're standing in society, where you're placed in the society, in the strata, is based on qualities that you gain through birth. You didn't do anything to get them. You were born female or male, or somewhere in between today. But let's just go back to the old way of thinking about this when all this started. You're born female or male. You were born into a certain racial or ethnic category. The social class of your family of origin is an ascribed status, which you can change, right? You're born into a certain religion, which is an ascribed status, but which you can change. Most ascribed statuses you can't change, but there's a couple where you can do something about. So an achieved status is based on qualities that you achieve by taking action, getting a college degree, getting married, et cetera, those types of things are achieved, getting a job promotion, whatever. So some examples of the ascribed statuses, these are things that are out of a person's control. Race, okay? Now we know, and race is in quotes again, as you know in your book, it's not biologically real, but it's a way we speak about people. It's a way we identify people. So there's some possible flexibility with race, correct? Some people could, quote, pass into the highly desirable, vaunted white race because of the privilege that being white, gives to people. But in general, that's a major ascribed status. Ethnicity is another one, which one can also pass. Gender used to be very strictly ascribed, but it's flexible now to a little bit more, some flexibility there. Age is another ascribed status. And you go through certain stages, but when you're a child, your ascribed status as a child. Okay, when you're an adolescent, your ascribed status is adolescent. When you're an older person, that's your ascribed status. Now, achieved statuses are based on some attainment. It's like anyway. It's up. You can have upward or downward mobility. When you think of achieved, you think of upward, but falling from a very high, privileged place in society. Um, a young person of a very wealthy and powerful family who winds up on Skid Row due to drugs or something of that nature. That would be downward, achieved. That's an achieved status to be homeless and addicted. Uh, you did it, so it's achieved, but it's not a highly achieved status. We tend to think of upwards with achieved status. So, but it's upward or downward mobility. And there's categories that people fall into based on their status. So it's your position or your standing in society. It might be being a student, a wife, a husband, a retired person, a political leader. If you're a member of Phi Beta Kappa, that says something about you, right? That's a category, and that's an achieved status. So the thing about each status has an accompanying role. It has expected behavior that goes with it. It has how to look, behave, talk, as part of that role. Some statuses / roles have much more prestige than others. And often they're marked by a particular lifestyle, the goods that one owns, one's leisure activities, linguistic styles of speaking. All of those identify people in terms of their ascribed status and the roles they inhabit in those statuses. And there are often ways of excluding other people from entering certain statuses. They're called exclusionary practices of keeping lower status groups out of higher status groups by marrying, remember homogamy, marrying the same kind of people type of thing, or socializing only with certain people in the group that you're in, the status. So one of the major forms of achieved status is social class. And social class, and now we're getting into the stratification aspect of things, refers to a person or a group's position in society. And that is primarily defined by economic terms, not your value as a human being or your personality, or it's purely, where do you fall on average income, basically, your household. In many cultures, economics is a key factor, and particularly in Western industrialized nations, in determining a person's status. In other cultures, that's less important. But in our society and other, as I said, Western industrial, digitalized, post-industrial societies, it's your economic status that really counts to a great extent. So class and status, here's another interesting factor, don't always match. You can become wealthy, extremely wealthy, but in very disreputable ways, as your book puts it. You can be a mafia boss. Well, you got a lot of wealth, but you do not have a lot of status except within the mob, right? But you're not highly regarded or looked up to by, the rest of society. So in capitalist societies, we have this thing called a meritocracy. Your book, now think about this word, the ocracy part refers to power over, and merit is just what it means. It means that if you're in a high status, you deserve to be there because you're smarter, better, or whatever than other people. And that is a ideal that we have in America, this ideal of a meritocracy. And the full title of it is a meritocratic individualism. We're the most individualistic country on earth as well. We value individualism much more highly than we do community or a variety of other things, and more than other countries do. So it's the belief that the rewards go to those who earn them and deserve them. Now, we all, I think, for the most part, know that that's not necessarily true. It is in some cases. It's certainly not in other cases. Getting into Yale with a C minus average, for instance, which George W. Bush did he merit that? Did his grades, did his attention to school, to, the classroom work, his writing merit him getting into Yale? No. Nobody else with a C minus average could get into Yale. But he was the son of two previous alumni, maybe three, I can't remember if his great grandfather went there too, who donated huge amounts of money to Yale. And so that's an example that's often used. There are many, I'm sure you can think of them, for people who are in very high positions of power and status, but really it's not due to anything that they merit or deserve. So in contrast, the structurist perspective says, wait a minute, it's the power of your economic class position that shapes a person's life. But here's the key point: the ability to choose one. Okay. Now, once again, the structurists make that all sound, functional structuralism, very, very nice, except that how much of an ability does one really have to choose their social class? You have some. We all have some. But it's not easy, as I'm sure many of you know, okay, to move up the social class ladder. That is primarily why most people go to college today, is to improve the social class, the income of their family and themselves. Now, looking at it from a conflict perspective, the concept of class was very central to Karl Marx's work and thinking. And what he said was that class differences are a result of the exploitation of the working classes by the owners of the capital, owners of means of production, i.e. capitalists. And that class consciousness among workers and class conflict are or will be the forces that cause the downfall of capitalism. He truly believed, and he may be right, we'll see, if that people would get tired of being ripped off for low wages, no access to health care, crummy vacation time, unfulfilling jobs, horrible bosses, et cetera, where the corporation basically, or the company or the business, has all the power and the worker has virtually none. That people would get very angry about that, and eventually they would revolt, and eventually we would have a more equal society. And in a sense, as I've said before, he was right. And if you look at the Russian Revolution, the Chinese Revolution, the French Revolution, etc., unfortunately, they didn't stay particularly equal. But it was the idea of the workers getting a consciousness of being their needs and just survival were not being met by the system. So let's look at ascribed status, which is, we've looked at social class first. Now we're going to look at race, ethnicity, gender, and caste, okay? So those are the four major areas of ascribed social stratifications, which divides people into unequally ranked groups on the basis of those four: race, ethnicity, gender, and caste. And we'll look at caste or caste. Both pronunciations are correct, and I seem to interchange them a lot. So caste or caste is determined by your birth, and it's linked to particular occupations. This is primarily in South Asia, in India, where this system is so formally entrenched and so ancient. It's thousands of years old, pretty hard to change when a society's been run that way for literally thousands of years. So the caste system is linked to occupation. And there are local variations or specificities within that, but within the different castes. But all four of the main top castes have some important features that they share. And it's based on a class system. First, they all relegate large numbers of people to particular levels of entitlement and to various forms of livelihood. We'll see what they are in a moment. Power, security, esteem, and freedom. That's a very important point. By birth, into which caste you are born into, just the luck of the draw, although from a Hindu perspective, it's not the luck of the draw. It has to do with reincarnation and how much work you've done in previous lives, et cetera, spiritual work, that is. You're relegated. And you can't move out of those systems in India. You really can't. So that's the first point. Okay, it's thousands and thousands, millions of people that are categorized in certain ways just by the fact that they're born into a particular family that belongs to a particular caste. Okay. The second, those with greater entitlements dominate the fewer. Well, that's true in virtually every culture, but it's particularly powerful in India. Third, the dominant groups, here we go with privilege seeking to maintain privilege again. So the dominant groups seek to maintain their position consciously or unconsciously. And the way they do this is through institutions that control the ideology among the dominated. And this is true not just of caste, but it's true of, if you can see this in a larger sense. Let's go back to the idea of sharing this, how all four of these ideas, okay, race, ethnicity, gender, caste, they all share categorizing people. This is the second one, those with greater entitlements want to keep them. The third is the dominant groups seek to maintain their position through institutions that control ideology. So religion is a very powerful one. And they also keep them in control, right? The less dominant groups through institutions that suppress subversion by the dominated group. So anytime there's social movements, uprisings, we've had them recently with Black Lives Matter, that type of thing, they get suppressed as quickly as possible. And then the fourth point is that all the systems apply to all of the four categories. Remember, race, ethnicity, gender, and caste. That in spite of efforts to maintain dominance, there are always these movements bubbling up from the oppressed. So if you think about women's rights, civil rights, I just mentioned Black Lives Matter. There's many, many, many more we could talk about. But that's the fourth point, is that if you oppress and suppress people, they will, as Marx said, it will eventually make people angry enough that they move to change things. So now we're going to take those four categories, race, ethnicity, gender, and caste, and look at them all individually here. So race, once again in quotes. That's a relatively recent, believe it or not, once again, you have to look at history and understand that it's really due to the Age of Discovery in the 1500s in Europe, when Columbus and other folks went around the world and bumped into people, different colors, different eye shape, different distribution of body hair, different cultures than they had ever known existed on the planet, right? In some cases, like with the Aboriginal people in Australia, some people in Africa, like Pygmies, they didn't even believe they were human. So there's, it was a big shock to them, and the way that they dealt with that was, was seeing this. They had to be. They were so different that something was wrong with them. Okay. In Europe at that time, the cultures were pretty homogeneous. So there wasn't really no concept of what we think of as race. It was all about ethnicity and different of the three main, monotheistic religions, Catholicism, Protestantism, and Judaism, and that type of thing. So ethnicity was much more important than race, and it wasn't till they found people who looked so completely different, whose cultures were so completely alien, that this idea of different races developed. The key feature of racial thinking is the insistence that behavioral differences among people are, quote, natural or inborn or biologically caused. So, head size, there's, they measured parts of all kinds of parts of all bodies. They did this with Native American as well, and skeletons. Head size, head shape, brain size, for example, were things they looked at. Are these people so different from us? They have a different head shape, and that. So, but as you know now, after over half a term of anthropology, it's culture, not biology, that is the key explanation for behavior. So thus, as you know as well now, race is not a biological reality. There's no way to divide human beings into distinct races, and every culture does it differently, by the way. You could be black in America, get, on your driver's license or whatever, and get off a plane in Brazil, and that's not how you're identified at all. So race is a social reality, as we've talked about, in terms of entitlements, status, and treatment. For example, we know in the U.S., major racial discrimination it persists today into the 21st century. I mean, it's pretty amazing when you think about it, but it's very, very powerful. So it's not a biological reality, but is certainly a social reality. So let's look at ethnicity. That's group membership based on a shared sense of identity, usually based on history, a territory, a home country, language, religion, a combination of all of those things more commonly. And so it can be a basis because remember, territory is a key part of this, and language. It can be a basis for claiming certain entitlements to resources, to land, to buildings, to artifacts, or for regaining some of those. Again, so if you look at Native Americans' reclamation of land or artifacts from museums, etc., those are entitlements based on ethnicity. So, but in general, states, and they don't mean states like in America, we're talking about nation states here, don't like ethnic groups at all. They're troublemakers. They're different. They're, whatever. They feel they're entitled to certain things. So they manage them, some better and more kindly than others. China, they view them as threatening security, so they often ban languages. That happened in Iraq with the Kurds. They couldn't speak or learn their own language in school. It's happening in Tibet with China. China's got official policy on ethnic groups that isn't very nice. So, and then when people get pushed and oppressed, and those ethnic groups, they move into different territories to get away from the oppression, then there's a reaction in those territories that they move into, and there's a Culturama story about what we call the gypsies. Roma is what they call themselves, and the correct term for them. They are what's called a diaspora population. They have no home country. They have no home base anymore. They move around. Okay. And so examples of marginality and stigma of ethnic groups is very prevalent. And we don't have to go look at other countries. Immigrants in the United States, risk major discrimination. And so did your relatives when they came. Are the Irish white folks? Yes, but they were Catholic and they were poor. And so they were horribly oppressed when they came here. People didn't like the Poles or the Germans and the Scandinavians did the best when they came here in terms of oppression, but they too were, had problems. So there's 4 categories of discrimination: verbal abuse, property damage, workplace discrimination, and physical harm. And as the study in the text is about immigrant groups in Canada, and it turns out that verbal abuse is the most common form of discrimination, at least in Canada. I would imagine that that's true in the U.S. as well. The names, the offensive names we call people, some of us call people, and I think we have a very high rate of hate crimes in America based on race, and it's the highest of all forms of hate crimes: gender, age, disability. Racial and ethnic hate crimes are the highest that we have, the most amount of hate crimes that we have. So if you look at that was race and ethnicity forming there. So let's look at gender and sexism. Well, like all forms of discrimination and stratification, they're based on the idea of perceived differences. We perceive differences among people, and then we make assumptions, usually negative, and quite often, most of the time, incorrect assumptions about them based on those perceived differences that we see. So to understand the basis of this, here we are at the term patriarchy again, rule of the father, literally, which is the dominance of men in economic, political, social, and ideological domains. One of the key points your book points out here, so much research has been done on this, it is not universal. You may think that the dominance of males in societies is a cultural universal. It is not. It also varies from culture to culture where it exists, the patriarchy and the dominance of males. It varies in both its severity and the results. Under the most severe forms of patriarchy, which tend to be in Muslim countries, but not exclusively. India is a Hindu country primarily, and it's got some bad stuff too. But women in many of those cultures, women and girls are completely under the power of males, and they can be killed with impunity, referring to honor killings, for instance, in Muslim cultures where fathers and brothers murder daughters and sisters if they've gotten out of line in any way that can be imputed to be inappropriate behavior with another male. The male gets off scot-free, of course, and they're rarely punished, etc., etc. So what's a matriarchy? A matriarchy is the dominance of women in economic, political, social, and ideological domains. So the definition is the same as patriarchy, except that it's female instead of male, right? So, except for one couple of things, and we've talked about this before. First of all, nobody can prove that there is an existing matriarchy or ever was. a matriarchy. Because we can't find any cultures where women regularly have power and abuse males as an institutional part of society, are abusive to males. Okay. So if you look at the societies that were more, the better term, as I've said before, is matrifocal. The focus is on women. So we're talking about the Iroquois here, for example, in this part. Women controlled the public finances, which was in the form of maize that they grew. They determined when war would be waged. They chose the leaders. The leaders were male, but the women, Council of Elder Women, chose those leaders. So it was, your book has this long, complicated term for those kinds of cultures, gender egalitarian with a mixed and balanced gender system. Yes, but they were matrifocal. Most of the time in those gender balanced cultures, property flows, for instance, inheritance flows from the eldest female to her daughters. We've talked about this before, but clan names, naming who you belong to, in terms of lineage, is matrilineal in those cultures generally. So now we're going to move to caste and casteism. That's the form of social stratification that I talked about earlier as an example of Hinduism. The family you're born into is your karma, and that family belongs to a certain caste, and that's it. You never move out of that, maybe till your next reincarnation. And here are the caste: the Brahmins, who are the priests; the Kshatriyas, who are the warriors; Vaishyas are the merchants; Shudras are the laborers; and at the very bottom are the Dalits, the famous untouchables. You've probably heard of them referred to that way, the outcasts or untouchables, who do all the dirty work in India. Isn't that convenient? And there are parallels that can be made in this country and other modern countries of the people who do all the dirty work and the class that they inhabit and the kind of money that they make and how they're treated by other people, etc. So what happens in those first three castes, the Brahmins, the Kshatriyas, and the Vaishyas, the priests, warriors, and merchants, the adolescent males go through these an initiation ritual, which represents rebirth. And then after that, they can wear what's called a sacred thread. It's just a thread that goes diagonally across the chest. And what that signifies, by wearing the sacred thread, it lets everybody know that this male has been through this sacred initiation ritual of rebirth, and that they are what's called twice born. Now, those upper four castes can't be in any contact with the Dalits. That's why they're called untouchables. Just being in the same room, if you're a Brahmin, and breathing the air, the same air that a Dalit breathes, makes you impure. And therefore you have to go through these involved and complex and sometimes very long purification ceremonies. So of course they avoid being in contact with them to touch them, to, God forbid, ever eat any kind of food that a Dalit has touched, et cetera, et cetera. But Gandhi changed the terminology, and what we call things, it's such a powerful statement from the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, what we call things determines how we think about them. So from Dalit untouchable, Gandhi called them the children of God. And I don't know how to say that in Indian, but in Indian language. So he completely, at least for his followers, changed a bit the way they thought about them. So they keep these categories, these cases, so strict through marriage. You can't marry anybody who's not in your own case. There are subcastes within the case, but they all stay within the same major one. So there's higher, lower income levels, education levels, et cetera, et cetera. So there are very strict marriage rules. And in 1949, the Indian Constitution, when they became an independent country after colonization, by Great Britain for a couple of hundred years, declared that discrimination based on caste is illegal. But it didn't do much to change anything, just like in America, in the reality of people's everyday lives. The late 20th century, there were policies put in place, and once again, this is very much like the civil rights movement here. There are things that are better now here in terms of access to resources for people, uh, particularly African Americans. There were late 20th century policies to improve the Dalits' social and economic advancement by doing things like reserving places for them in medical school, which they could never previously attend. And reserving places for them, we would call this affirmative action, in government and public service jobs. And of course, that infuriated many of the people in the upper case, and particularly in the top case. Isn't this interesting? The one to be least threatened by it was the most threatened by it, because you got to go through 3 other cases to get up to the top, Brahmins. But they were infuriated by it and felt most threatened. All right, so that's looking at those levels of social stratification that we've talked about. I hope you can see their relevance to today's life, to life in the United States. As I said at the beginning of this, we have one of the most highly stratified societies. I think it's the most, in fact, I think I can say unequivocally, the most stratified society of industrialized modern nations. So kind of shifting here from the stratification discussion, because this started out with social groups, you remember this as well. Now we're moving to the subject of civil society and what that means. You have the government and the military, right, which are institutions that make laws and run things in the country, okay, in any country. But you have this other element that comes civil, think of civilians, that comes from the people, in a sense. So it's a collection of interest groups, not formal governmental groups, not the military, but groups of civilians who have a particular interest. And so they're interest groups that function outside of the government, and they organize and help to organize economic and then other aspects of life as well. So what Hegel said was that those groups and institutions exist between the individual and the state. So civil society is not individuals, it's groups of individuals who form for a particular purpose. But it's not the state, it's not the government either. So they exist between the individual and the state. An Italian researcher, Gramsci, said that there's 2 types of them. And this is really interesting. There are civil groups that support the state. For example, churches and schools, right? Don't schools help inculcate patriotism, following the rules, et cetera, et cetera? Churches usually support the state. Usually, a little different today, but in general and historically, churches support the state for the most part. So there are civil institutions that support the state, and there are civil institutions that oppose state power. So trade unions are a perfect example of that, which your text brings up. But and social protest groups. So you think about citizens' rights groups. Once again, all the movements that we have seen that people belong to oppose state power and change and make change. Those are civil institutions as well, but there's, as I said, there's two different kinds: those that support the state, those that oppose. So civil society, if you look at those for the state, the example that your text gives you is the Chinese women's movement, and how the government built those civil societies behind the scenes. Kind of, it's a civil society, but it's in support of the state, and with the state's support, to do certain things to improve women's lot in China. So to improve the quality of their lives and work and pay and that type of thing. But the government oversees it at all levels and gives very limited access to people doing any kind of research, like anthropologists and things of that nature. Now, so that's an example of a civil society that is in both supported by the state and pro-state. Activist group example, they're talking about the first one. They were talking about the comadres, the mothers in El Salvador, who organized to oppose state violence, and sadly, because so many of their children were the desaparecidos, the disappeared. They were murdered by the state. They'd leave to go to high school or college one morning and never come home, and that was it. And they were murdered by the government. And so they are involved in, and so other kinds of organizations are formed with the goal of changing certain conditions, such as political repression, violence, things like human rights organizations, once again, Black Lives Matter, the Civil Rights Movement, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. And so some of the examples are women's votes for women. So even, that first movement it was the first wave of feminism, of getting the right to vote, which took a full generation to happen, of women. The women who started the movement were not alive when women actually got the vote in 1920. But that is an example of an activist movement. The civil rights movement is an example. I meant that. Voting rights. We're seeing voting rights movements today. We're seeing fair pay movements today. Gender equality rights is a huge issue. So those are people that organize, work, create formal institutions, and that then oppose the government. So the comadres, as I said, El Salvador had all these dead children and the horrible government there that was unfortunately backed by the U.S. government at the time, and killed anybody who opposed the government, as well as a lot of indigenous people. So by the 1990s, it started in the 70s, I think. Let me see here, 77, yeah. But by the 1990s, it had become so big, and it had grown and focused on holding the state responsible for human rights violations during that civil war previously, on the protection of prisoners, seeking human rights protections for the future, working against domestic violence, educating women about political participation and economic projects for women. So it started on this one focus of where are our dead children, and grew over the years, from 1977 to the 1990s into addressing all of these very important social issues. So what these organizations do is incorporate both the person and the political into the work. So that old 60s motto, the personal is political, is so true at all times. How you vote, what you buy, what you eat, what car you buy, where, all of those things can be perceived, and actually are at bottom, although a lot of people don't have a lot of choice, let's say that for sure, to get that out of the way. But if you do have choice, those choices are political. Do you buy clothing that's made in basically slave worker factories, in very poor countries, That's a choice, right? And it's ultimately a political choice. So there are many other examples, but I won't go on with them right now. But that's how people evolve when they often get involved in activist groups, to begin to see, oh, okay, the personal and the political are co-joined with each other. So one major lesson from the commandos, the experience, they've been deeply studied, I'm sure, by political scientists and anthropologists and sociologists, economists, everybody. But one major lesson that was learned from that movement of women, of mothers, is that activist groups formed by women that are based on kinship and domestic concerns often, that's how they begin. But their impact can reach the top of the public political hierarchy. And I would say that, once again, the voting rights movement in America, women's right to vote, was an example of that. So now we're going to wrap up here by looking at social capital, social movements, and social media. I don't know if you're familiar with the term social capital. It refers to human capital is another word that is used for it. It's the intangible resources that exist in social ties and cooperation among people. We think of capital as only being dollars, but this idea changes that way of thinking, that capital is more, bigger than that. It isn't just money. It's what we can contribute together, what we can do together through social ties and cooperation. So one of the things, and I just heard this, I was watching the news last night, and a reference came up to the multiplier effect. That's one of the effects of being in a social group. When you bring people together and you build social solidarity and this sense of group security, it creates something larger than itself. That's the multiplier effect. It spills over into other aspects of people's personal lives. The organization grows. You saw what happened with the comadres, starting with one single focus and developing into an organization that addresses a whole bunch of things. That's the multiplier effect. And it creates a non-monetized form of value that you can bank, in a sense, and cash in on when you need. You have this group of people now with social media. Of course, you can just text people, call, whatever, and the flash protests and things of that nature. So the more people in a movement, the more the multiplier effect. And so another point here is that social movements, sociologists use the term, social scientists, anthropologists as well, use the term new social movements to refer to the many, many social activist groups that have emerged in the late 20th century around the world. And they've emerged because people have had it up to here, right? It's just that's exactly what Marx said would happen. He said there will be a breaking point where inequality, injustice, etc., I'm mad as hell, I'm not going to take it anymore, is kind of, paraphrasing what Marx was thinking about on a large scale, with a large bunch of people feeling that way. And now these groups can take advantage of new forms of communication, the internet to broaden membership, et cetera, that can work for good or ill, as we've seen recently. But it's certainly a way to reach people. And then this chapter ends with something that made me chuckle, because it says, "Look at how we get emails from leaders," and he mentions the author, she got an email from Barack Obama. Well, I get them too. I get emails all the time from anything from our congressman in Oregon to, yes, the president or the speaker of the House and things of that nature, letting me know what's going on, maybe fundraising, whatever. But it's very funny to see an email come in from those folks. So that's it for this week, and we will move on. Next week, we're nearing the end of the term. Kind of exciting, I'm sure. We're getting into some really interesting things in the next couple of weeks.